Thank you very much. So my name is Devaney. I'm the project manager for the Precision Medicine Initiative at the White House. My background is actually in genomics, and I spent some time in a genomics lab and then have been doing science policy since then. Started at the National Institutes of Health, and while there, the president announced this initiative, and we on the NIH side worked to develop some of the research components of the initiative, and then I joined the White House to help coordinate the many agencies and activities that fall under this initiative. So essentially, the president's vision for this is that we have a really important opportunity right now with biomedical research, what we understand about health and disease, and electronic health records and other data types to take advantage of this and start to learn more about health and disease, and specifically, and I think importantly, about health and prevention and how we can all stay healthier. So in the State of the Union, he alluded to the initiative, and then he officially launched it at the end of January in a public event. And there's a number of different components, which I will briefly go over for you guys. There's a couple of scientific research components to the initiative, and then also some policy priorities that we have, and some other different aspects that I'd like to talk about briefly today. The Precision Medicine Initiative mission statement is pretty broad-reaching, but it helps us remember what it is that we're trying to do at the end of the day. So our mission statement is to enable a new era of medicine through research, technology, and policies that empower patients, researchers, and providers to work together towards development of individualized care. And that is a mission statement that I think a lot of organizations, researchers, and healthcare providers across the country ascribe to. And we are, very quick to acknowledge that precision medicine is not new, that this idea of treating individuals based on their individual characteristics is something that medicine has reached for a long time and is decades old, hundreds of years old. If you look at prescription glasses or blood donation, other examples where we have been trying to actually implement precision medicine in medical care. However, we have a situation where we have a number of diseases and conditions where there really are no effective treatments. So, and at the same time, we have a really important opportunity right now. We have the ability to sequence a genome in a day for $1,500. We have other omics technologies that are available and are evolving pretty rapidly. We have high compute capabilities today where we can store data, analyze data, mine data at scales were not possible even 5-10 years ago. We have electronic health records being implemented across the country. Almost 90% of all providers now have electronic health records on patients, and there's a lot of information captured there on individuals' health. And most importantly, I think right now there is a real movement out there amongst patients and participants to actually be partners in research and to not be human subjects, but to be research participants. And so with that in mind, one of the central tenets of the Precision Medicine Initiative is that participants should be engaged and should be partners and should be involved in the governance and decision-making about some of the studies that we're proposing. So I'll briefly walk through the different components that have been put forward as part of this initiative, and just keep in mind that we are still building the initiative, so we're trying to do this with a lot of stakeholder engagement and activities, but it is still largely in the process of design. There are a couple science priorities that the president put forward and has put forward in his proposed FY16 budget, which we hope to get this year. There's a cancer component, which is really about taking a lot of the success we've already seen in oncology, precision care, and expanding on it. So the National Cancer Institute conducts a lot of clinical trials where they're looking at the mutations that drive a cancer as opposed to the tissue where the cancer originated, and trying to treat cancer based on the underlying genomic defect as opposed to where the tissue of origin. And they've seen a lot of success in that, and so the idea is to expand this to cancers where there really aren't effective treatments. And they're also going to be expanding into pediatric cancers, which is really important. And there's a proposal for, that's sort of shovel ready, and the National Cancer Institute is ready to move forward with those plans and expand on the success they've already seen. Then there's the other side of the house where we're really trying to design a research study that will allow us to take some of the success they've seen in cancer and apply it to other diseases. And that's this large national research cohort, which you may or may not have heard of, which is planned to be 1 million or more Americans who volunteer to donate data about themselves into a study that would then allow researchers to access these data with biological questions and learn a lot about health and disease in real time, longitudinally. So that component, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go on, but I'll just mention we also have a couple policy priorities. So we want to make sure that we have the right privacy and security safeguards in place for these data, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. I think that will be of interest to this group. And also the FDA has been working really hard to think about a new regulatory strategy for how to regulate technologies like genomics and others that are complex and rapidly evolving, and making sure that the tests, like genomic tests, if you're doing whole genome sequencing, how can you verify that that's accurate, and so patient safety in mind, while also being nimble to the evolution of this arena and making sure that we're not stifling innovation in those technologies. So FDA has been working really hard on that, and in fact have a couple workshops coming up in mid-November where they'll talk with the public about their plans. It's been really exciting to see that happen. So going back to the research cohort, there was a process over the summer. The National Institutes of Health would be launching this national research cohort of 1 million or more Americans. They ran a process over the summer with an expert working group of external experts, so the NIH managing the working group, but this was all external experts for the most part, who over a series of public workshops devoted to specific topics got a lot of public input and put together a report on what would be the optimal design for a study this large, and that would allow you to really learn the things that we want to learn about people's health and how we can treat disease better and emphasizing health. And that report came out in mid-September. It had a number of different recommendations in it. I would definitely recommend, if you're interested, going to NIH's website, and you can find the precision medicine page of the whole report is linked there. Has a nice executive summary as well. They really emphasized participants being at the center and being involved in the governance and understanding their rights and responsibilities as participants. They also emphasized the idea of giving information back to people, so people who participate in studies this big, being able to access information about themselves and about the studies that they're enrolled in at their preference, depending on how much or little someone might want to know. And they also talked a lot about how to reach underserved populations. So some of the folks who aren't connected to large research or large healthcare organizations, and how to make sure that they're able to volunteer to join this study if they wish to. They will be enrolling, once this cohort is stood up, they will be enrolling in 2 different ways: direct from individual, so if somebody off anywhere wants to enroll, they can enroll, and then also through collaboration with large healthcare networks like Kaiser or Geisinger or organizations like that who wish to partner. So none of that has been decided yet. And then those organizations would help to enroll people who are interested. And then the other thing that I would say they emphasized was strong data security and privacy, and open access to researchers to use the data so that this resource is actually being broadly tapped. And then maybe I'll talk a little bit about, and we can get into any more details you want to in questions, but I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing, what we're thinking about with data privacy and security. When the president made his launched the initiative in January, he emphasized that we would incorporate privacy from the beginning and not lob it on after the fact. So as the working group, the ACD working group that the NIH pulled together was coming up with the recommendations on the design for this study, the White House pulled together an interagency group to think about what would be the principles that would govern privacy that could be flexible to changes in technologies over time, but would be sort of the principles under which you would pin implementation. And as part of that process, they pulled in a bunch of experts to a number of roundtables, combed the literature for other studies and organizations who thought about this, or other studies who have their own privacy policies, and looked at a lot of the privacy policies that are out there already, pulled together a set of principles and working in an interagency way. It was co-chaired by the White House, but also the Office for Civil Rights and National Institutes of Health. And then put together some principles which covered a number of topics, including governance and how participants can expect a study of this size to be governed, transparency, so making sure that everybody understands what it is exactly is happening with their data and specimens and how they're being used, respecting participant preferences, including how consent will be gotten, and then also individuals' rights to know more or less about themselves under the research studies, as well as withdrawing consent at any time. Participant empowerment through access to information. So that's the piece where we have heard loud and clear from the general public and various sectors of patient populations, et cetera, that people really want to learn something about themselves. So if they're really going to be involved in a study this big, they want to get some information back. And so we're emphasizing that and trying to understand with a little more granularity what exactly that means to people, and hoping to be able to offer some different levels of options for people who participate to say yes or no, they want to know this or they don't want to know that. And then data sharing, and so that participants understand how their data will be shared and accessed and used, and then data quality and integrity. So making sure that if somebody sees something wrong in their data, that they're able to report it and get it fixed. And so those policies, or those principles, went up for public comment in July, and we got a number of comments back, which was nice, which is great, and we're in the process now of updating them, and the final will be posted in the coming weeks. At the same time, that group thought a lot about data security and realized that we actually really didn't have the right expertise around the table to think about security, which is a related but separate topic from privacy. And so we are running a very similar process on security to develop what we think will be the right data security framework, including a lot of the folks that were involved in the privacy principle development. So we have nice cohesion there, but making sure that we're also tapping into the right expertise, that the people who are really thinking about security at a time when data security is certainly not a guarantee. So there will be some forthcoming, and in fact, we're holding a roundtable next week with external experts, so non-government folks. And so if anyone here has recommendations on great data security minds, we'd love to include them in that, so let me know. And I think I will end there and ask if there's any questions, and maybe we can have more of a discussion.
I got one for you. There's been, over the years, lots of controversy over if someone's body is used for something, do they have ownership, do they have a financial interest in it? Where is the wind blowing on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and in fact, that has been something that bioethicists have been debating for quite some time. I mean, we would never say in the Precision Medicine Initiative that we own the data. In fact, we feel very compelled that their participants need to be included in the governance and understanding and making decisions on how that data is held, but also that somebody who is a participant in the study can withdraw their consent and pull their data back.
Even if a drug company is about to make a drug from their biologic material?
We have, in our principles, we have said, if somebody wants to withdraw consent, they have to understand that the data that is currently in use or is aggregated cannot be withdrawn. So when they first sign the consent, they're agreeing to include their data, and at any time they can withdraw that, but we can't disentangle it from studies that are ongoing.
As you may know, the United Kingdom has had some quite contentious discussions about this very sort of topic. The government was proposing a program called care.data, where they were going to, the idea was to open up decades of national health patient data to researchers, and then it came out that they were also planning to sell them to third parties, and the whole thing has been wildly delayed. But there are a couple of questions that keep coming up in the UK, and one of them is about mission creep. How do you resist? How do you teach somebody in a data center somewhere to resist when police come along and say, we'd just like the list of everybody who's been through, that your data shows who's been through drug treatments. And if, in terms of recommending experts, I strongly recommend you look up Ross Anderson at the University of Cambridge, who has done enormous amounts of work on this over the last decades.
Great, thank you for that. So to address the first part of your question about compelled disclosure, at least in terms, we have some protections there. I'm not sure that we have exactly the right protections, and we have, at the same time that we've been running this process to develop the privacy principles and to design the framework for what this study will look like ultimately, we have also been looking across the various policies that we have and looking for any gaps, including in privacy area. And one of those that we've talked a lot about is compelled disclosure. So the National Institutes of Health has certificates of confidentiality, which essentially is a authorization to a researcher who's been awarded public money to do research, to deny any forced disclosure of the data that he or she holds. The certificates of confidentiality are optional, so a researcher has to ask for one. Under PMI, certificates of confidentiality will be used, so that will be sort of a policy decision that the PMI cohort will make. But in general, when we're looking at across federally funded researchers, they have a choice to ask for one or not. And the certificate of confidentiality in its current form, while strong and empowers the researcher, it also does not require them to withhold that data from compelled disclosure, so they can choose to hand it over and just let you know. I know the National Institute, the Department of Justice, I think that's who it is, has a similar, I think they call them privacy certificates. I'd have to look this up, and I'm afraid I don't have all of the details, but I do know that they have a stronger model where you're actually, as a researcher, you're actually not allowed to hand over any data you're doing or you're holding under compelled disclosure. So we're looking at options for strengthening, but I do know that at a very minimum, PMI will protect against compelled disclosure as best we can.
So have you moved towards actually putting pen to paper and coming up with the consent form that participants will sign and what that looks like exactly? Just how broad and open-ended is the consent that participants will be asked to sign?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have emphasized that the consent in PMI should not be a one-time interaction, that there should actually be it should be more of an ongoing interaction. I think, a consent form tends to be a single point of contact with a participant, and we're thinking of it more as like a dynamic conversation over the years, opportunities to change your preferences under the consent. However, of course, there will be a consent document that folks will sign up front in some form. The components of that document have not been written yet. We don't have people enrolling into the program or anything like that, and we don't have the IRB stood up. So all of that is still forthcoming. The report only came out 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I do envision that there will be somewhat of a broad consent, but the idea is that participants can come back and revisit and change their preferences over time. As you may know, the Office for Human Research Protections just put out a proposed rule for the revisions to the Common Rule. And in the proposal, so this is still a proposed rule at this point, I think the comment period is open until December 2nd, and this is all about, the Common Rule is all about how we protect research participants when they volunteer for research. In that proposed rule, they are now allowing use of a broad consent document for data and specimens. So in the past, what is currently the case now, the status quo right now, is that if you are a researcher and you have a specimen in your freezer, you can use it for research as long as the name has been stripped off without consent from the participant. In this proposed rule, the federal government is now proposing that you must have consent to use specimens for secondary research studies down the road. So I am a researcher and I take a sample and I use it on my study that I've asked you for your consent for, and I freeze it. Today, under the current rules, I can then go back and for a future study, take the name off of it and use that sample in a de-identified way. The proposal that's out now through OHRP acknowledges that de-identification is not really a real thing anymore, and so a specimen can be re-identified quickly and easily these days. And so that people should at least understand that they have a choice on whether their specimen will be used secondarily for research in their data as well. And so I think that's a really important advance. There's also the other side of the debate, which says, I think where people argue that broad consent is not really informed consent, or it can't be informed because by nature it's broad and open-ended. I personally feel like it's an advance from today where we're using people's samples without their understanding. So we'll see where that lands. That's still a proposed rule. So we'll see where that lands. But those are the regulations that would govern. But PMI will use a consent that will be open-ended and will be asking for broad consent, but will be very interactive with their participants. The plan.
Have you had any thoughts about interacting? You say the kind of information that people will get back might be awfully technical, might be some very high-end data analysis, copyrighted papers not available freely and not easily understandable. With a big mismatch between probabilities, the same kind of discussion that people went through about whether gene tests should be available on the open market. So what kind of discussions and thoughts, not very far along yet?
No, it's a great question. We have actually talked about it quite a bit, and I know the working group that put out this report in mid-September thought about it quite a bit. They recommended that as part of the governance that will ultimately make a lot of these decisions that will involve a lot of participants and patients, that they take on, that there be a sub-governance structure that think about how and what types of data be returned to people and how they're returned. And there are regulatory and state laws that we need to make sure that we abide by, including CLIA, the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment Act, and HIPAA, which both govern what types of information you can and should give back to people. So those will be taken into account. But then there is this question about how you make things available to people in a way that's digestible and that they understand. So I expect that a lot of that conversation will happen over the coming months. I will say that we want to bias towards sharing more information as we can under the law with people as they want it, but we really want it to be preference. We don't want to give people information back that they don't want. So while we've done a lot of thinking on that, we have not made any concrete decisions about how to support some of that information. In terms of publications and copyright, we will be encouraging that at least aggregate findings like that be returned to people. So that's a pretty low lift thing where if a researcher makes a discovery using data from this large cohort, that the people who had contributed data should be able to have access to that publication. Yeah. That doesn't get at the question of the translation of it, because some of them can be pretty technical.
But understanding is different. Jim Watson had his entire genome sequenced, but there was only a small piece that related to his probability. He thought at the time of whether or not he would get Alzheimer's. And he said, just mask that little piece for me, please. But then he said, you may have seen him, he said, well, unfortunately, I didn't ask them to mask enough. I should have asked them to mask another 100 base pairs. So, yeah, I was able to find out what I didn't want to know. But we didn't know that at the time. That didn't come out until a few months later. Yeah. So there's always those kinds of questions. Interesting.
Yeah.
So if I decide to participate in it, and my genetic code is part of the cohort and is put in the database, then the database is made pretty much accessible to any researcher, because I know you guys are emphasizing sort of the open source nature of it, so that not just professional academic hardcore researchers can access it, but it can be a million eyeballs looking at it, and that will have lots of advantages for research. And so presumably my DNA would be de-identified or removed from my name, but other than that, basically it's going to be out there for anybody to look at, right? And sort of analyze in any way that they want.
So the idea on how the data will be managed right now, and again, I'm saying a lot of this without actual implementation, a lot of the implementation details have not been laid down yet. But the idea is, and this was recommended in the report, there's actually quite a bit of detail in the report on how a program like this could and should be designed. There's a lot of thinking that went behind this. So the idea is that there will be different layers of data available at, sort of like at a funnel effect, from broadly available down to very controlled access. I would imagine that genomic data would fall closer to the bottom, where you actually, as a researcher, would have to apply for access to those data. And it would not just be out there for anybody to get on their smartphone and click through.
What kind of data would be the broadest level that high school students, for example, look at?
Yeah, you can imagine a scenario where we would have aggregate data, like census type data, that would be broadly open to folks. But we haven't really gotten down to what exactly those types of data would be at this point. But I would think that would be the type of data. It would be aggregate level data in the same way that the census manages it, where you can have access to aggregate data, but not individual level data of a single person. Here is Jay's DNA and his EHR and his mobile device data.
And then for the researchers who do get access to those detailed data, they agree not to make attempts or with the most detail actually identified, or would even that be attempted to be identified?
Yeah, I'm certain the data would be de-identified.
Well, there might be certain applications where they want to follow up with me, or
Yeah, but so a participant who joins PMI will have the ability to say, please do recontact me or don't recontact me for additional studies. And so if you don't want to be recontacted, you just won't. And then communications will happen at the governance level, not from individual researchers, I imagine.
so if a researcher discovers something in my DNA that I've previously indicated that I want to hear about such things, then the researcher will tell me that it will be filtered through the government structure. They will inform me that I have this killer deal in my DNA or what have you.
It's a good question. NIH needs to, now that they've got the design report, they need to come up with all of those implementation details at this point, and the governance that's going to be helping to set some of those rules, because the return of it, I don't know exactly how the communications are going to happen from the governance to the individuals.
Sorry.
And the IRB hasn't been established, and they'll have to look at all of that and the protocol and the consent and all of that before anyone is involved.
But so the vision is, if a researcher is looking at my most detailed health information, including my genetic code that's been de-identified, they agree not to make efforts to de-identify it.
To re-identify it.
Re-identify it,
Right.
sorry, yeah. And then, I don't know, that seems like it would be difficult to enforce for all the same reasons that privacy invasions are often so visible and undetectable.
Yeah.
And then, I guess, what's your thinking around that, or what's the thinking around that, and what kind of, would it just be barred from further research using it, or what would the punishment be? Do you need law passed in order to give it teeth? So, talk about that.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about that, because of course re-identification is really hard to enforce. Somebody who broke any of the agreement that they made with the governance on access to the data would no longer have access to those data. That's sort of the easy thing, and that can be governed by PMI. But when we're looking at national policy, we've thought a lot about where there might be gaps in our national policy on this. So I think we need to think about that quite a bit before we launch the cohort. But this has been an issue with research. We've been thinking about this for a decade now. As the genome becomes more widely available and genomic data becomes more easily accessible and people are combining it, this has been one of the fundamental questions, is how do we prohibit re-identification of individuals? I think one thing that's really important that we can do is when somebody is agreeing to participate, that we make it very clear to them that there are risks. And a lot of the risks with something like this are informational and not interventional. Like you would be undergoing if you're in a clinical trial. This is really informational risks, and trying to be as transparent as we can about what those informational risks are.
Or I would say we're actually kind of a bit over time, but if there's one more question, we could probably go a little long on this, and then we'll go until about 3:25 or 3:30.
So you've got 1,000,000 genomes. Who has access to the data, i.e. can a researcher, a member of the public, do research, say, on the population frequency of a specific gene? For instance, a patient group wants to know what the frequency is in their favorite gene. Would they have access to that?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that specific question, but so the idea is could you look at the allelic frequency of
Yeah, it takes
mutation
some
X?
doing to get, put together a research project. You need $1 million, right? Whereas if I go to the 1,000 Genomes project, I can probably actually browse the genes now. On the other hand, if I had access to the genes and I also had my 23andMe results for $99, I could identify my full genome pattern easily. If I had brief access to the full data.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wary to commit to anything because we just haven't worked out what the different data tiers and access will be at this point. But I could imagine a scenario where aggregate data like that might be available to different people. But at a broader level, then you must sign this agreement. And
I've thought about a few of these things because I was thrown out of the ClinSeq conference study during the screening, and I don't know exactly why. Perhaps because I had a master's in computer science and had previous genetics tests and said I'd be interested in seeing my data.
huh.
Great. So thanks so much for